The city of Volgograd stands today as a modern metropolis on the banks of the Volga River. But 80 years ago this city bore a different name, Stalingrad, and it became the stage for one of the most brutal and decisive battles in human history. Between August 1942 and February 1943, over 2 million soldiers and civilians would fight, suffer, and die in these streets. The Battle of Stalingrad would not only determine the fate of the Soviet Union, but would mark the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions of world domination. This is the story of courage and cruelty, of survival against impossible odds, and of how one city became the graveyard of Hitler's dreams. On June 22, 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery, crashed across the Soviet border. Hitler's goal was clear: destroy the Soviet Union, seize its resources, and eliminate what he called the Bolshevik Jewish threat. The initial assault was devastatingly successful. Soviet forces, caught unprepared despite warnings, retreated in chaos. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. By December 1941, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. The German advance left a trail of destruction across the Soviet Union. Villages burned, civilians fled or were murdered, and the Red Army suffered catastrophic losses. In the first 6 months of the war, the Soviets lost over 3 million soldiers, killed or captured. It seemed nothing could stop the German war machine. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin ordered a desperate defense, and as winter arrived, the German offensive stalled before Moscow. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had been stopped. The harsh realities of the Eastern Front began to reveal themselves. The autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud, a phenomenon the Russians called Rasputitsa. German tanks, trucks, and supply columns became hopelessly bogged down. Then came winter, more severe than German planners had anticipated. Soldiers froze in summer uniforms, weapons seized up in the cold, and vehicles refused to start. The blitzkrieg that had conquered most of Europe was grinding to a halt in the vast expanses of Russia. By summer 1942, Hitler was ready for a new offensive. Having failed to take Moscow, he shifted his strategy southward. The plan, called Case Blue, Fall Blau, aimed to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus, resources Germany desperately needed to fuel its war machine. But there was another objective, one that would prove fateful: a city on the Volga River, named after Hitler's greatest enemy, Joseph Stalin. Taking Stalingrad would cut Soviet supply lines, secure the German flank, and deliver a psychological blow to Soviet morale. It seemed like a strategic masterstroke. It would become Hitler's greatest mistake. Before the war, Stalingrad was a thriving industrial centre. Stretching for 30 miles along the western bank of the Volga River, it was home to over 400,000 people. The city's factories, particularly the tractor factory, the Barricadi weapons plant, and the Red October steelworks, were vital to the Soviet war effort, producing tanks, guns, and ammunition. The city also served as a crucial transportation hub, with the Volga River providing a lifeline for supplies moving north and south. For Stalin, the city that bore his name had immense symbolic importance. Its loss would be unthinkable. As German forces approached in August 1942, panic gripped the city. Stalin had forbidden mass evacuations earlier, fearing it would damage morale and war production. Now, with the enemy at the gates, a desperate exodus began. Civilians crowded onto ferries and barges, crossing the Volga under German artillery fire. Families were separated, children lost their parents in the chaos, and thousands drowned when boats were hit by shells. Those who remained, whether by choice, duty, or inability to escape, would face the approaching hell alongside the soldiers. Stalin appointed General Vasily Chuikov to command the 62nd Army, the force tasked with defending Stalingrad. Chuikov was a tough, practical soldier known for his aggressive tactics and refusal to retreat. He would establish his command post not in safety behind the lines, but right in the city itself, often within a few hundred meters of German positions. His philosophy was simple: fight for every building, every room, every staircase. Make the Germans pay in blood for every meter of ground. This strategy of hugging the enemy, staying so close to German lines that they couldn't use their artillery and air superiority effectively, would define the battle to come. On August 23, 1942, the Luftwaffe launched one of the most devastating air raids of the war. Over 1,000 German aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs on Stalingrad. The city erupted in flames. Wooden buildings disintegrated, oil storage tanks exploded, and firestorms consumed entire neighborhoods. In a single day, more than 40,000 civilians were killed. The Volga River itself seemed to catch fire as burning oil spread across its surface. By nightfall, Stalingrad was a blazing inferno visible for miles. The Germans believed the city was finished, its defenders surely broken. They were wrong. The bombing transformed Stalingrad into a nightmarish landscape of shattered concrete, twisted metal, and smoking ruins. But this destruction would actually help the Soviet defenders. The rubble created natural fortifications, making German tank advances nearly impossible. Every ruined building became a fortress, every pile of debris a defensive position. The Germans, who had excelled at mobile warfare on open terrain, now faced a new kind of battle: urban combat at its most brutal and primitive. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, pushed into the city. These were veteran soldiers who had conquered Poland, France, and much of the Soviet Union. They expected Stalingrad to fall within weeks, but the Red Army, though outnumbered and outgunned, refused to break. Soviet soldiers fought with fanatical determination, knowing that behind them was the Volga, and beyond that, the heart of Russia. There was nowhere to retreat. Orders from Stalin were absolute, not one step back. The fighting quickly descended into a savage, close-quarters struggle. Battles raged for individual buildings that soldiers grimly nicknamed Pavlov's House, the Grain Elevator, the Red October Factory. Germans and Soviets fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes on different levels of the same building. Grenades were thrown through holes in floors, machine guns fired through walls, and soldiers fought with knives, shovels, and bare hands when ammunition ran out. One Soviet commander reported that the lifespan of a newly arrived soldier in Stalingrad is 24 hours. For an officer, it's 3 days. The grain elevator became the site of one of the battle's most legendary fights. 50 Soviet soldiers held this massive Satusanachi concrete silo for 5 days against repeated German assaults. Germans tried flamethrowers, tanks, and artillery, but the defenders fought on. By the time the Germans finally captured it, only 40 dead Soviet soldiers and 18 wounded Germans remained. The building was nearly destroyed, but its defense had bought precious time for other Soviet units, Zatsundurus, to fortify their positions. This pattern, stubborn, costly defense of every position, characterized the entire battle. German armor, which had been so effective in the open steppes, became a liability in Stalingrad's ruins. Tanks couldn't maneuver through rubble-choked streets and were vulnerable to close-range attacks. Soviet soldiers developed specialized tank hunting teams that would hide in basements and cellars, waiting to ambush German armour with anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines. The hunter became the hunted. The northern factory district containing the tractor factory, barricadi, and Red October plants became the epicentre of the battle. These massive industrial complexes with their warehouses, workshops and rail yards provided ideal defensive terrain. Soviet workers continued producing tanks and weapons even as battles raged around them. In some cases, newly manufactured tanks rolled directly from the factory floor into combat just meters away. The factories became fortified zones where the fighting was so intense that soldiers measured advances not in miles or kilometers, but in meters. In this hellish landscape, a new breed of warrior emerged, the sniper. Soviet snipers became legendary, using the ruins as hunting grounds. The most famous was Vasily Zaitsev, credited with over 200 kills. Snipers would hide for days in rubble, waiting for a target. A German soldier who raised his head at the wrong moment would be dead before he heard the shot. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers lived in constant fear of the invisible enemy. The Germans sent their own counter-snipers, leading to deadly duels between the best marksmen on both sides. Each kill was a small victory in a battle where small victories mattered. Soviet propaganda worked overtime to turn Stalingrad into a symbol of resistance. Photographs of heroic defenders, stories of individual courage, and Stalin's proclamations that the city must not fall were broadcast across the Soviet Union. The message was clear. Stalingrad was more than a city, it was the line that could not be crossed. This propaganda had real effects, stiffening the resolve of defenders and ensuring a steady stream of reinforcements willing to cross the Volga into the inferno. Getting reinforcements into Stalingrad was a nightmare operation. The Germans controlled the western bank and had artillery positions that could hit the river. Soviet troops crossed at night on barges, ferries, and anything that would float. German artillery and aircraft rained fire on the river crossings. Many soldiers drowned or were killed before reaching the western bank. Those who made it across knew they were entering hell. There was a saying among Soviet troops, "Crossing the Volga is a one-way trip." Yet they kept coming wave after wave to feed the meat grinder. One building became perhaps the most famous in the entire battle, Pavlov's house. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small group of soldiers captured this four-story apartment building and held it for 58 days against constant German attacks. They fortified it with machine gun nests, anti-tank rifles and minefields. The building overlooked a key square, giving Soviet observers a perfect view of German movements. Germans threw everything at Pavlov's house: infantry assaults, tank attacks, artillery bombardments, airstrikes, but it never fell. Soviet propaganda later claimed that more Germans died trying to take Pavlov's house than died taking Paris. While exaggerated, the defense of this single building exemplified the ferocious Soviet resistance throughout the city. General Friedrich Paulus commanded the German Sixth Army, the force tasked with taking Stalingrad. Paulus was a meticulous staff officer, intelligent and methodical, but he lacked the boldness and decisiveness needed for this kind of savage battle. As the weeks turned to months and casualties mounted, Paulus grew increasingly anxious. He sent repeated requests to Hitler for permission to withdraw or for reinforcements. Each time, Hitler refused. "Where the German soldier sets foot, there he remains," Hitler declared. Paulus, bound by his Prussian sense of duty, obeyed. For German soldiers, Stalingrad became a waking nightmare. They called it Rattenkrieg, rat war, fighting in sewers, cellars, and ruins. The close-quarters combat neutralized German advantages in training and equipment. a soldier who had survived campaigns in Poland, France, and North Africa, found himself stabbed in the dark by an enemy he never saw. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, terror, and the feeling that this battle was different from all others, that Stalingrad was a place where normal rules didn't apply, where death waited around every corner. German military censors monitored soldiers' letters and were alarmed by what they found. The letters spoke of shortages, brutal cold, and mounting casualties. Soldiers wrote of rats as big as cats feeding on corpses, of the constant stench of death, of seeing their friends blown apart by Russian artillery. Some letters were almost despairing. "We are fighting for every pile of rubble, for every cellar. Everything is on fire. By day there is no safety anywhere. Stalingrad is hell." These were not the triumphant letters of victorious soldiers, but the desperate words of men trapped in a disaster. The casualties mounted relentlessly. By October 1942, the Sixth Army had lost over 40,000 men killed, with tens of thousands more wounded. Entire divisions were ground down to skeleton strength. Fresh replacements arrived and died within days. The cemeteries grew. German commanders began to realize what their soldiers already knew. They were not winning this battle, they were dying in it. By mid-October 1942, the situation for the Soviet defenders was desperate. The Germans controlled over 90% of the city. The 62nd Army was compressed into a narrow strip of land along the Volga, in some places only a few hundred meters deep. Chuikov's command post was repeatedly overrun, forcing him to move multiple times. Ammunition ran low, food was scarce, and casualties were catastrophic. German commanders believed the final collapse was imminent. One more push, they thought, and Stalingrad would fall. Maps from this period show just how desperate the situation was. Soviet-held territory was reduced to a few isolated pockets, the largest being a narrow strip along the Volga, no more than a few city blocks wide in most places. German forces could literally see the Volga River, their objective just meters away in some sectors. But those last meters proved impossible to cross. Soviet defenders fought with absolute desperation because they had nowhere to retreat. Behind them was the river, and beyond that, the entire Soviet Union depending on them to hold. The October fighting reached levels of intensity that shocked even veterans of this brutal battle. Battles for single buildings lasted weeks. The fighting was personal and primitive: rifle butts, knives, sharpened shovels, and bare hands. Germans and Soviets fought in the dark, in ruins so destroyed that attackers and defenders couldn't tell who was who until they were face to face. One German soldier wrote, "We have fought for 15 days for a single house, using mortars, grenades, machine guns, and bayonets. Already by the third day, 54 German corpses are strewn in the cellars, on the landings, and the staircases. The front is a corridor between burnt-out rooms. It is the thin ceiling between two floors." Everyone fought in Stalingrad. Women served as anti-aircraft gunners, snipers, machine gunners, and medics. Many fought as desperately as the men, knowing that German occupation meant rape, slavery, or death. Female snipers like Tanya Chernova became legendary. Women's anti-aircraft units fired at German aircraft, and when necessary, lowered their guns to fire point-blank at German tanks and infantry. The defence of Stalingrad was truly total. Soldiers and civilians, men and women, Russians and soldiers from across the Soviet Union, all fighting together against the invader. While the world's attention focused on the desperate street fighting in Stalingrad, Soviet commanders were planning something far more ambitious. General Georgy Zhukov, the Soviet Union's best military strategist, convinced Stalin to adopt a bold plan. Rather than continue feeding reinforcements into the city's meat grinder, secretly build up massive forces north and south of Stalingrad, then launch a double envelopment to surround the entire German Sixth Army. It would be one of history's largest pincer movements. Stalin, desperate for good news, approved the plan. It was codenamed Operation Uranus. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Hit the weak Romanian armies protecting the German flanks, north and south of Stalingrad, break through and link up in the German rear, trapping the Sixth Army in a giant pocket. Throughout October and early November 1942, the Soviets secretly assembled over 1 million men, 13,500 artillery pieces, 900 tanks, and 1,100 aircraft. German intelligence failed to detect the build-up, convinced the Soviets were exhausted and incapable of a major offensive. It was one of the greatest intelligence failures of the war. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began. At 7:30 a.m., Soviet artillery opened fire with a barrage that shook the frozen earth for miles. After 80 minutes of bombardment, Soviet tanks and infantry surged forward. The Romanian Third Army, holding the northern flank, collapsed almost immediately. Poorly equipped, lacking anti-tank weapons, and with no German support nearby, Romanian units disintegrated under the assault. Soviet tanks poured through the breach, racing west and south towards the town of Kalach, where they would link up with the southern pincer. The Romanian collapse was catastrophic. Within 48 hours, the entire Romanian Third Army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Tens of thousands of Romanian soldiers surrendered, died, or fled in panic. The same story unfolded on November 20th, when the southern pincer attacked the Romanian Fourth Army. German commanders were shocked at the speed of the Soviet breakthrough. Paulus, still focused on the battle inside Stalingrad, suddenly realized his entire army was in mortal danger. On November 23, 1942, Soviet forces from the northern and southern pincers met at Kalach, 60 miles west of Stalingrad. The trap snapped shut. The entire German Sixth Army, over 290,000 soldiers, was now surrounded. Also trapped were parts of the 4th Panzer Army and various Romanian units, bringing the total to over 330,000 Axis soldiers caught in the pocket. It was one of the largest encirclements in military history. In Berlin, Hitler received the news with disbelief. How could an entire army be trapped? The Germans called their new prison the Kessel, the cauldron. Over 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were now trapped in a pocket roughly 30 miles wide. Paulus immediately recommended a breakout attempt, abandoning Stalingrad and fighting westward to safety, but Hitler refused. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised that his aircraft could supply the pocket with 500 tons of supplies per day. Hitler, seizing on this promise, ordered Paulus to hold firm. A relief force would break through to rescue them. Until then, they would form a fortress and tie down Soviet forces. Göring's promise was a fantasy from the start. The Luftwaffe never came close to delivering 500 tons per day. On good days, they managed 100 tons. On many days, weather and Soviet fighters prevented any flights at all. Soviet anti-aircraft guns ringed the pocket. Soviet fighter planes hunted German transports mercilessly. German transport planes were shot down by the dozens. The men inside the pocket slowly began to starve. Daily rations were cut, then cut again. Soldiers ate their horses, then cats and dogs, then rats. By December, men were dying of hunger even before they saw combat. The airfields inside the pocket, Pitomnik and Gumrak, became scenes of desperation. Wounded soldiers, many with frozen limbs needing amputation, crowded around the landing strips hoping for evacuation. When planes landed, fights broke out as men struggled to board. Officers had to use armed guards to maintain order. Pilots faced an agonizing moral dilemma: take on wounded men or load the precious space with fuel and ammunition that the troops inside needed to survive. The airfields themselves were under constant Soviet artillery fire, turning evacuation into a deadly lottery. Hitler ordered Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's best commanders, to launch a relief operation. Manstein assembled a force of about 30 divisions, including elite panzer units, and launched Operation Winter Storm on December 12th. The plan was to break through to Stalingrad, establish a corridor, and supply the Sixth Army while it held the city. For a moment, it seemed possible. German armoured spearheads advanced to within 30 miles of the pocket. Inside the Kessel, soldiers could hear the distant rumble of Manstein's guns. Liberation seemed tantalizingly close. But Manstein's relief force couldn't break through the Soviet defences. Soviet reserves rushed to block the German advance. Fierce battles raged in the snowy steppes. Meanwhile, Paulus refused to attempt a breakout, to link up with Manstein, claiming his men were too weak and had too little fuel. The moment passed. Soviet counterattacks forced Manstein to retreat. By December 26th, the relief attempt had failed. The men inside the Stalingrad pocket now faced the horrifying truth: no rescue was coming. They would have to survive the winter or die trying. January 1943 brought cold so severe it seemed designed to kill. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, never properly equipped for Russian winter, suffered horribly. Uniforms froze solid. Weapons stopped functioning. Flesh froze to metal. Soldiers stuffed newspaper under their clothes for insulation. Thousands suffered frostbite, losing fingers, toes, ears and noses. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Surgeons performed amputations without anesthesia in unheated buildings. The wounded often died not from their injuries, but from cold and infection. Death came in sleep. Men went to sleep and never woke up, frozen corpses by morning. Starvation reached catastrophic levels. The official daily ration dropped to 200 grams of bread, made mostly from sawdust and ersatz ingredients. Many soldiers received less. Men became walking skeletons, too weak to fight, barely able to move. Horse meat was a luxury. Soldiers scavenged frozen corpses for scraps of food. Some units resorted to cannibalism, though this was kept secret and vehemently denied. The hunger was maddening, all-consuming. Soldiers hallucinated about food, dreamed about meals from peacetime. Many simply lay down and died, lacking the strength to continue. Soviet propaganda teams worked overtime, bombarding the pocket with loudspeakers and leaflets, promising food, warmth, and humane treatment to those who surrendered. Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia, one leaflet proclaimed, with a metronome ticking in the background. Many German soldiers were tempted, but fear of Soviet captivity and loyalty to their comrades kept most fighting. The Soviets offered Paulus terms for surrender multiple times. Each time, under Hitler's orders, Paulus refused. Hitler was adamant there would be no surrender. The Sixth Army would fight to the last man. On January 10, 1943, the Soviets launched Operation Ring, the final assault to destroy the pocket. Over 280,000 Soviet soldiers attacked from all sides. Soviet artillery pounded German positions. The thinly held German defensive lines cracked. Soviet forces advanced, splitting the pocket into smaller sections. The end was clearly near, but Hitler continued to forbid surrender. He promoted Paulus to field marshal, reminding him that no German field marshal had ever surrendered. The message was clear: die fighting or kill yourself, but do not surrender. Paulus understood the implication, but he was no longer the man who had entered Russia 2 years earlier. He was exhausted, defeated, and unwilling to sacrifice more lives for a hopeless cause. By late January, the Soviets had captured both German airfields inside the pocket. No more supplies could be flown in, no more wounded could be evacuated. The men in the pocket were completely cut off from the outside world. The pocket continued to shrink as Soviet forces advanced from all sides. Germans retreated into the ruins of Stalingrad itself. The city they had spent months trying to capture was now their final refuge. The irony was bitter. The buildings they had once attacked with tanks and aircraft were now cellars, where they huddled, hoping to survive one more day. Surrender began in small groups. Soldiers, too weak to fight and knowing the end was near, walked towards Soviet lines with white flags. Some units surrendered en masse when their commanders realized further resistance was murder. The fighting fragmented into isolated pockets, each making its own decision to fight or surrender. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus himself surrendered to Soviet forces at his headquarters in the basement of the Wehrmacht department store. He did not commit suicide as Hitler had implied he should. He chose captivity over death. 23 German generals surrendered with him, one of the greatest military disasters in German history. When Hitler learned of Paulus's surrender, he erupted in fury. He could have shot himself, Hitler raged. What hurts me so much is that the heroism of so many soldiers is wiped out by a single coward. But Paulus was no coward. He was a man who had watched his army destroyed by Hitler's obsession and had finally chosen to save what remained. In Soviet captivity, Paulus would later join a committee of German officers opposed to Hitler, lending his name to propaganda efforts against the Nazi regime. His capture was a propaganda disaster for Germany. A field marshal surrendering was unthinkable, yet it had happened. The final German holdouts surrendered on February 2nd, 1943. The Battle of Stalingrad was over. Over 91,000 German and Axis soldiers went into Soviet captivity, including 2,500 officers and 23 generals. They were skeletal, frozen, many suffering from typhus, dysentery, and frostbite. Most would never see home again. Soviet camps were themselves struggling with shortages, and they were unprepared for such masses of prisoners in such terrible condition. Disease and starvation continued to kill thousands in the camps. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, only about 6,000 would eventually return to Germany, many not until the 1950s. For most, Stalingrad became not just their battlefield, but their graveyard. The statistics of Stalingrad are almost incomprehensible. Axis forces lost over 850,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The entire Sixth Army destroyed, along with parts of 2 Romanian armies, an Italian army and a Hungarian army. Soviet casualties were even higher. Estimates range from 1.1 to 1.3 million killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The civilian death toll was approximately 40,000 to 50,000, though exact numbers will never be known. The city itself was obliterated, an estimated 99% of buildings destroyed or damaged. Stalingrad had ceased to exist as a city and become a symbol. In Germany, Goebbels declared 3 days of national mourning. Radio stations played only solemn music. Theatres and entertainment venues closed. The German public was shocked. For the first time, many Germans began to doubt whether the war could be won. The myth of Wehrmacht invincibility was shattered. Whispered conversations questioned Hitler's leadership. While open opposition remained dangerous, the psychological impact of Stalingrad on the German home front cannot be overstated. The defeat marked the beginning of doubt, and doubt would eventually become despair. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was a moment of redemption and vindication. The Red Army, which had been shattered and humiliated in 1941, had surrounded and destroyed an entire German army. Soviet propaganda made the most of the victory, portraying it as proof of Soviet superiority and the inevitable triumph of communism over fascism. Stalin's prestige soared. The Soviet people, who had endured unimaginable suffering, finally had hope that victory was possible. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resistance and determination that would define Soviet identity for generations. Strategically, Stalingrad marked the turning point of World War II on the Eastern Front. Never again would German forces mount a successful strategic offensive in the East. The initiative passed permanently to the Soviets. The Red Army, learning from its victories, became increasingly effective, employing better tactics and more sophisticated operations. Meanwhile, the German army, bleeding men and material it could not replace, began a long fighting retreat back toward Germany. The road from Stalingrad led ultimately to Berlin, though it would take 2 more years of brutal fighting to get there. Today, on Mamayev Kurgan, the hill that was one of the bloodiest battlefields of Stalingrad, stands one of the world's most imposing war memorials. The motherland-called statue, a 279-foot-tall monument of a woman wielding a sword, dominates the skyline. The memorial complex includes walls inscribed with the names of thousands of defenders, an eternal flame, and ruins deliberately preserved as reminders. It is estimated that every square metre of Mamayev Kurgan contains hundreds of pieces of shrapnel and fragments of human bone, even 80 years later. The hill itself is a grave. The Battle of Stalingrad stands as a testament to the horrifying extremes of human conflict. It demonstrated both the depths of cruelty humans can inflict and the heights of courage they can reach. Over 2 million people fought in streets where survival was measured in hours, not days. They fought for ideologies, for their nations, for their comrades, and simply to survive one more day. But Stalingrad's legacy extends beyond the battlefield. It proved that Nazi Germany could be defeated, inspiring resistance movements across occupied Europe. It vindicated Stalin's decision to fight rather than negotiate, though at a terrible cost. It showcased the effectiveness of Soviet deep battle doctrine and the Red Army's ability to conduct large-scale, complex operations. And it demonstrated that modern industrial warfare had reached a level of destructiveness that threatened to consume entire societies. The name Stalingrad became synonymous with desperate, close-quarters urban combat. Military strategists study it as the quintessential example of urban warfare. The tactics developed there, from Chuikov's hugging defense to the use of snipers and tank hunter teams, influenced military thinking for decades. Every urban battle since, from Berlin to Grozny to Aleppo, bears Stalingrad's shadow. For those who survived, Stalingrad was an experience that transcended normal human experience. German survivors spoke of it with a mixture of horror and awe, describing it as a place where hell came to earth. Soviet survivors carried it as a badge of honor and trauma. They had endured what no humans should have had to endure and had emerged victorious. The psychological scars lasted lifetimes. In 1961, the city was renamed Volgograd as part of Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign, but its wartime name remains the one remembered by history. The battle that bears Stalin's name became his greatest propaganda victory, even as it showcased the horrific human cost of his brutal tactics and refusal to allow retreat. The irony of Stalingrad is that it vindicated Stalin's strategy while simultaneously revealing its terrible price. Today, as we remember the Battle of Stalingrad, we remember not just a military victory or defeat, but a human catastrophe. 2 million casualties in a single battle. We remember the soldiers on both sides who showed extraordinary courage in the face of horror. We remember the civilians who became victims of a conflict not of their making. And we remember that the battle that saved the Soviet Union and broke Nazi Germany came at a price almost too terrible to comprehend. The ruins of Stalingrad whisper a warning across the decades. This is what happens when nations commit themselves fully to total war, when ideologies clash without mercy, when human life becomes mere statistics in a struggle for domination. The burned bricks and shattered concrete of that city on the Volga stand as a monument, not just to victory, but to the capacity of humans to inflict suffering on each other, and to endure it. Stalingrad was the turning point. After Stalingrad, the path led to Berlin. After Stalingrad, the world knew that Nazi Germany would fall. But the cost of that turning point, measured in shattered lives, destroyed homes and frozen corpses in the ruins, should give us pause. Victory came to Stalingrad, but at such a price that we must ask ourselves, what victory is worth such destruction? What ideology is worth such sacrifice? The ghosts of Stalingrad still ask us these questions, and we owe it to their memory to seek answers that prevent such catastrophes from ever happening again.